Welcome to Cooking the Books. I'm Frances Cook. Something needs to change in our housing market. That much is clear. But what? Prices have been spiraling up for a while now, and the last year has only seen things get more intense. Increasing numbers of people feel locked out of buying their own home, a core part of financial stability in New Zealand for generations now. So what needs to change? Is it our government policy, bank policy, our wider culture, all of the above?
News Talk ZB presents Cooking the Books with Frances Cook.
I'm joined now by Sam Stubbs from Simplicity. Now, obviously, New Zealand houses, very expensive. The Herald's running a whole series on it at the moment, and particularly first home buyers, they've been feeling the pain on this. Do you think there's a main cause to your mind?
No, actually. Look, we've done a lot of work into this, and the reason for high prices for houses in New Zealand is actually many little reasons that add up to a lot. So there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that anyone can do which will dramatically change the price of houses, except for supply, right? So demand and supply. If you up the supply, to meet the demand, the prices will stabilize. And if the supply goes up too much, it may go down. That, by the way, could happen. I mean, we can talk about that. But if you look at the house prices now, land's expensive, consenting is expensive, building materials are expensive, labour is expensive, real estate agent fees are expensive, unit titling is expensive. Everything adds up to being very expensive. So attacking it needs a lot of actions in a lot of different areas. And it's interesting when you look. So we're having a serious look at this sector ourselves, both in terms of investing, maybe build to rent, maybe build to own. What we've worked out is that if you vertically integrate it, like if you control everything you possibly can and do it in scale, you can eliminate a lot of the costs. You can probably build between 25 and 35% cheaper than you currently can now. But you have to control it. You cannot be a subscale, bespoke producer, because then you're feeding a lot of people in the chain. So sorry, that was a very long-winded way of saying no. There is no quick fix. Houses in New Zealand are expensive for a whole lot of reasons.
Well, I mean, you're not wrong, right? There's so many factors, and this gets brought up whenever the government brings in something that is supposed to help. People say, but what about this? What about that? What about the other? There are so many factors that go into it. I'm interested in what you say there about, if you're able to control the whole process. And that's obviously something that hasn't happened in New Zealand much. I mean, our business community is full of small to medium enterprises. The landlording community is full of the sort of cliche term is the mum and dad investor who has one or two houses. Is that a sort of cultural shift that we might need to make?
Yeah, look, if you look at every other, big developed housing market in the world, they have what they call institutional investors, so pension funds. So, for example, the equivalent KiwiSaver manager in Germany, it's not called KiwiSaver there, but the pension fund, they would typically have 10 to 20% of their investments in build-to-rent housing, for example. When you get that, you get a volume buyer. That means you get efficiency of supply. And that also means that the people who do that for you are able to do it for other people as well, large volume buyers. So one of the problems with New Zealand is, you're right, everything is so small scale and bespoke, right? Everyone wants to have their house with their tiles on their land, with their trees, So you can do that. That's great if you can. It's wonderful. But that means you're a price taker. That means the people who are supplying that do it on their terms and conditions, not on yours, because you didn't have any buying power, right? So big pension funds and big institutional investors, when they have buying power, they can affect a lot of pretty significant change in the cost of producing it. So part of it is New Zealand being a small place. Part of it is not having enough money in places like KiwiSaver, so you get really large buyers of housing. And those are two of the 20 or 30 reasons why houses are expensive.
Yeah, and people talk interest rates all the time as well, right? And that's obviously relevant because it'll affect how expensive your mortgage is going to be. And it's one thing to have the house itself be expensive, but then you also have to calculate how much it's going to cost you each week to pay off.
Yeah.
And for now, of course, interest rates are very low. Depending on what kind of rate you get, a lot of people are expecting it to start going up again, maybe after a few years. But what do you think about the way that our mortgage rates and interest rates are set? Do you think that's helping or hurting?
It's both. Look, it's helping in the sense that if you can afford the deposit on a house, houses have never been more affordable in terms of repaying your mortgage, right? So here's the insanity of our market. Prices have never been higher. Mortgage interest rates have never been lower. So if you can get into the market, it's actually in much of the reason why house prices have gone up so much post-COVID is because people have realized, look, my mortgage interest repayments will be less than my rent. So if I could possibly get into a house, why wouldn't I buy it, right? So just as houses are so expensive, mortgage affordability has never been cheaper in terms of a percentage of your household income, right? So in many ways, mortgage rates help there. How they hinder that is because they're so cheap. And it's mortgage lending is so readily available. Lots of people buy houses and they bid up the price of the existing stock of houses. So there's not enough supply to bring prices down. So in that case, they're really bad for the first home buyer. They just keep on raising the bar, right? But of course, here's the bigger anomaly, Francis. I don't want anyone to think for a second that mortgage rates are cheap in this country. They're not. They're very expensive. If you look at the margin that the bankers are making over, so they're taking money via deposits. They're paying almost nothing for deposits now. They're still lending out at over 2%. So the spread, what we call the mortgage interest spread there, is huge. Banks are, and it has always been huge in New Zealand. That's why banks have always made about 20% more profit from a New Zealander than an average Aussie. And remember, these are Australian-owned banks making more money from Kiwis. The reason is that mortgage interest spread has always been so wide. It's still there. So mortgages should be a lot cheaper. I'll give you an example of how much cheaper they should be. Just as some of these banks are offering 1 year special 2.25% rates in mortgages and saying how cheap that is, here is little old simplicity. We're offering 2.25% floating rate, 2% below. You can actually lend at those rates if you want to. But if you want to make an awful lot of profit, you don't. So mortgage rates are not that expensive, but even though the headline numbers seem small and they're affordable, they're driving house prices up. I don't think that's going to change for quite some time.
Yeah, it's interesting there. And I'm just super quickly, for anyone who's listening to this and is new to mortgage talk, a fixed rate is exactly what it sounds like. You agree with the bank or whoever that you are paying this much interest for 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, whatever. A floating, your interest rate will change with the day-to-day of what interest rates are at the moment. And that's why we all get excited about an OCR announcement, because it tells us how much an interest rate is going to be. So super quick on that. But it's interesting there that you mentioned, there's been so much profit in this sector. I mean, yeah, banks are some of our most profitable businesses every time we come into reporting season.
Actually, the most profitable businesses.
Yeah. Yeah, they make so much money. And, you obviously are an investment company. You're looking at this area, right? Tell us a bit more about what you're doing.
Well, look, we're having a serious look, and we haven't, made any firm decisions yet, but we're having a serious look at whether or not the housing market in New Zealand could benefit from having some KiwiSaver money invested in it. Because if you think about KiwiSaver, there's $76 billion invested now. It's going to be $200 billion by 2030, according to Treasury estimates. It's a huge amount of money, right? And very little of it is invested in housing, even though housing has been quite a lucrative asset class for private New Zealanders who've been, investors. So what we're having a look at is there a market? If you think about, how I talked about before about, term deposit rates are really lousy. Well, we as KiwiSaver managers too, we put some money in the bank. Every single time you invest in one of our funds, a little bit of that money goes into the bank, and that adds up to being a lot of money. For us, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. And we're sort of thinking, look, we're getting paid almost nothing on that. Is there another asset class that we could put this money into, which would give us very reliable returns, higher than bank deposits? So classic example would be mortgages. Yes, we can. We're just doing what a thrift or building society did many years ago. We just take our members' money and we lend it to other members, and we make no money in the middle. That's why we can pay a KiwiSaver members 2.25% and still charge 2.25%. Everyone wins, but there's no bank involved, right? If our members win and the bank loses, I love that. That's fantastic. The Ducks love it as well. But the other asset class you look is build to rent housing, right? Because you think, look, if we could build houses for 100 years and rent them out at an affordable rent for a very long time, if we could give people lifetime rental agreements or rights of occupation or 5 or 10 year rental agreements, they would pay the rent and we would get more than we would get in the bank. So our members would win, the people renting the houses would win. And because there is so much margin there, because we'd be such a large scale builder, we would be able to build these things really, really well because we'd want to own them for 100 years, right? So we're having a look at that because that is not a new idea, Francis. That happens in Germany, France, Spain, England, Australia, America, everywhere around the developed world. Big pension funds like ours are looking at, well, in fact, already have lots of residential housing that they rent out affordably over the long term. And you know what that does for the housing market? The interesting thing is, for New Zealanders, it provides another option. People may want to buy their house. Great if they want to. They want to get in retirement villages. They're good if they want to. But there's no really large supply of affordable rental housing in New Zealand. No one does it in scale. And it's an option that everyone else around the world has. Why not here? It's also a really cool asset class because I'll tell you what happens, what's so great about it. And do you mind if I just talk investment speak here for a second?
Go for it.
If I was an investor in a KiwiSaver and I said, look, I want to make a 30-year fixed interest investment, there's nothing I can buy except US government bonds. But if we put that money into building housing, we would effectively have a 30 to 50-year investment, and it would be paying us a return higher than the bank, and it would be inflation adjusted because the rents would go up and down with inflation. And those rents would be the last bill people don't pay in a downturn. Right? When you get the next COVID, the first bill you always pay is your mortgage or your rent because it's the roof over your head. So it's very secure cash flow from an investment point of view. It's providing affordable housing. And as you know, we're a social enterprise, so we want to do good. We believe you can make money and do good. And it provides New Zealanders with another option for housing. So we're having a serious look at that because no one in New Zealand is doing it in the terms of KiwiSaver funds. We can't see any reason why they wouldn't do it. We just got to work out how to do it, right? It's all very well talking about it. These are just words. But how do you actually make it happen? So we're spending a lot of time on saying, is this practically possible? And so far, we think it is.
It's interesting, right? Because we've seen increasing noises again from the government on fairly structural changes, things like this for the housing market. And, you know, when we talk build to rent, for those who've missed some of the chat about it, it's a somewhat foreign idea in New Zealand, I feel, where developers will deliberately build this accommodation that is designed to be used by renters. They're not hoping to sell it to owner occupiers. They're selling it to investors or to even a commercial enterprise. Sometimes will buy an entire building and rent it out, the different apartments and things. And that's quite a shift, I feel, from you know, as we were talking about before, the mom and dad investors to these professional commercial landlords. And it's also, you know, there are ways you can invest, not through KiwiSaver as much as you say, but there are ETFs, exchange traded funds, where you can invest your money into property funds, and they are kept on the share market, but they are usually commercial property, so shopping malls or, you know, little shops on the main street and things like that. So this would be a huge shift in terms of what we're building, and also in terms of the way we invest in housing. It would make residential houses far more professionalized. Do you think that's a culture shift New Zealand would benefit from?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point you're making, so that you know, there's just a lifting of standards all over the place when you get big institutions, big money, big long-term investment. So you think about build quality, right? Let's just use an example. Let's say we wanted to do this. If we're going to hold these things forever, you know, you think about building the average house, a developer building a house, and they think, am I going to stick in that level of stainless steel, or am I going to go for a high level of stainless steel? If I pay more for the high level of stainless steel, no one's going to pay me for that. No one's going to appreciate it. I'm just going to maximize my margin, right? So you always build to the minimum building code. So you can say, it's got the building code, tick, it's all go. If you're owning it for 100 years, you don't think that way. You think, look, if we put that cheap stainless steel in, I've got to replace it. That cheap shower tub, I've got to replace that in 30 years. That's going to be expensive. No, we'll pay the 5 or 10% more to put in the unit that will last 60 years or whatever. And we'll do that with appliances, the very best appliances, the very best building materials. You know, you start thinking about building in concrete and steel and brick and all these things which are more expensive than sticking timber framed housing up. And so when you do that, you increase the quality of the building stock. That means you increase the capability for building more of that from other people as well. And then you start thinking about, well, you think about it this way, Francis, why do people want, what is the motivation between having a roof over your head? In New Zealand, so much of that has been, it's how you get rich, right? You buy a house because it's the best investment you can make, because the tax system has advantaged you for the longest time, and you get to live in a place, your kids get to go to the same schools, all that sort of thing. The alternative has been you rent, and think about renting. I mean, have you rented before? I've rented. I mean, it's a pretty lousy relationship, right? From renter and rentee. It's short term. There's a degree of mistrust. You have to pay bonds. You get property inspections. No one trusts each other. And it's a very short-term relationship. But you think about a bunch of people who would be happy renting long-term if they had security. So think about people who go into retirement homes right now. One of the reasons they go into retirement homes is because they get the medical facilities, and that's great. But the other reason is because then they're safe. Because they say, no one can throw you out of this. You can be here comfortably for the rest of your life. This is your home. It's just, and it's looked after and maintained and so on. Well, what if we could create a rental contract like that? I've stayed with friends in France and England who've lived in, they've had multi-generations of their family living in the same home, but it's been rented. They've never thought about owning it, but they treat it like their home. And so, you know, and I think that if you do that, you have a mutual relationship of trust, because if it's affordable and desirable, you're not going to abuse that trust, right? As a tenant, you're not going to rip off the landlord. The landlord is not going to abuse the tenant. And this is what happens all over the world, right? So you can build these things better. You can get supply. You can have trusting long-term relationships. And you know what? It's just another option. Maybe you'll say, listen, here's another example. Maybe you say, look, I don't want to buy a house in town, but I'll buy a batch and I'll rent in town. So I might still get it because I can afford a batch. You know, there's a whole bunch of different options. I love the idea. We have this thing called wow in simplicity. We only do something if it's wow, right? The wow for this, for me, is if we did this, is the wow is being able to say to a retired couple who can't afford a retirement home, who would otherwise have to go into short-term rental accommodation, and which is a nasty, horrible way for them to have to live. The wow is being able to say, you can be here for the rest of your life. You're safe, and it's affordable, and it's warm and dry, and they go, wow. Or you say to a family who could otherwise in these tortuous rental rollovers and changing. I met a family the other day. They'd been in 6 homes in 7 years. Kids had been to 6 different schools in 7 years. How do you expect them to turn into the best people they can possibly be with that sort of housing and security? Housing is a human right. So you say to them, you can't afford to buy a house, but you can be here and this can be your home for the rest of your life. Wow. You know, if you want to talk about, we talk about housing esoterically as if it's a financial asset and how we make money. Housing is the number one social stability thing. It's the number one thing that creates happiness. A warm, dry, safe place to live and sleep, not only for you, but for your children and your grandchildren. If as a society, you know, we talk about childhood poverty, we talk about, you know, crime rates, we talk about hunger, all these sort of things. If people had a warm, dry place over their heads, a lot of that would be, that's the number one thing to solve. Think about why the City Mission in Auckland is spending all this money on building a new place for the homeless to be warm and dry in. because they know how important that is. They could have spent their money on other things, but a warm, dry home is the single most important thing, right? So I know I'm sounding like a preacher here and I'll get my collar off and all that sort of thing, but if you think about making money and doing good, why can't we build this stuff, make money for our members, good long-term, safe, secure returns, and provide stable long-term housing security for a whole lot of people who wouldn't otherwise have it? That's what happens everywhere else in the world, Francis. You know, it is insane that a country like New Zealand, as wealthy as we are, with as much land as we are, still has people who have housing insecurity. It's just dumb.
It's so interesting what you're saying there about, you know, it's one of the core things that you need. I mean, what is the old hierarchy of needs? And they've got that pyramid of what you should have. And right at the very bottom of the pyramid is food and shelter. And those are key needs that you have to have. It does strike me when you're talking about building to rent. And as you mentioned earlier, that often you can get better deals if you're in control of it from the get-go. And often the way we've seen this work overseas is build to rent is a purpose-built apartment building where it's got shared spaces like rooftops, and it's, you know, it's built centrally so people can get to their jobs, and it's all designed to be very enticing to people who are renting, whether that's short-term or long-term. And it can often be built by the same people who are going to own it. And what strikes me is a possibility here. We've seen a huge reticence from New Zealanders, this reluctance to get into apartments, partly because banks often require a bigger deposit for apartments, but that's also partly driven by the fact that apartments don't gain as much in their capital. They don't go up as much in their value because, of course, what goes up in value is actually the land, and you are all sharing the land. The building itself is somewhat irrelevant. And you are, you know, all sharing the cost of that, the value of that land going up. Whereas if you own the entire building and you've built it to rent, you own that entire building, you've got a whole bunch of people in it renting from you, you're not so worried about that, are you? It might make apartments more attractive again, which to my mind, we desperately need.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that, you know, this whole idea of owning versus renting, how the capital gain gets carved up and so on, is very dictated by the tax regime, right? And there's no question that the tax incentives in New Zealand for home ownership and particularly home investing are slowly fading away, right? You know, most New Zealanders realise that too much money is being made by too few people, so they're now bringing bright line tests in and so on and so forth. So you're going to start finding that the tax incentive for investment property in New Zealand is going to start, it's going to start waning. That is the overall long-term trend in my mind. But that means that if you're thinking about investing in, it's not a capital gains thing, it's an income thing, right? And you're right. You know, if you own the whole facility, you have to create, it has to be enticing. It's going to, you know, it's a competitive market, the rental market. So, and that means, you have to provide the facilities. It has to be built well enough. It has to be warm and dry and so on. The really nice thing from a renter's point of view is if they have some sort of idea of the security of their rent, right? So they know that it's just not going to go crazy. They're not looking after the building. It's someone else's problem, right? And here's the other thing, Francis, that you know, most New Zealanders sort of, I don't think, have cottoned onto, or many of the economists I talk to haven't cottoned onto yet. In 50 years' time, our population may shrink. You know, if you look at the global demographics, it's going to peak around 2070, 2080, and it's going to start going down. And it's already happening in places like Japan and Korea, where you've got very low birth rates. And when that happens, what happens to the property market? Well, it's really interesting, right? It tends to centralize in the city. So being closer into town really matters because people are social, they want to be there. So I worry about subdivisions in Drury, for example, in Auckland, or I worry about subdivisions on the very outskirts because people want to have their piece of land and their house because that's the Kiwi dream. In places like Japan and Seoul and so on, those houses are depreciating now. And in fact, Italy, look at Italy. I don't know, in Italy, you can buy a house for $1 there as long as you promise to renovate it and turn it into a hotel for tourists. But you can get it for free in these Italian villages because the population's shrinking. So when you start thinking about what you would invest or live in, if you have a very long-term view, as we do, we're going to be investing money for 100 years. We're going to be around for 100 years. Got to think very seriously about that. So I think that, and everywhere else in the world, Francis, look, apartments, condominiums, all these things, there's no new ideas here. This has all been done all around the world in scale, in terms of management, what appeals to people, why they would want to live there. And they're very deep and broad markets. New Zealand we just stand out for having none of this. And none of that sets a pricing tension, right? So if you had a rental option that was cheaper than getting a mortgage, and you had security on it, you say, I can live here for the rest of my life. You may decide to invest in forestry. You may say, I'm not going to invest in houses anymore. And particularly when the tax incentive isn't as strong, right? When houses are on the same tax footing as every other investment, you may think, no, I'm going to flip into my KiwiSaver, or I'm going to buy a forest, or there's any number of things you could do with your money, right? You could even, if you're, feeling like gambling, you could stick it into Bitcoin.
Don't start me on Bitcoin.
Which, by the way, is gambling. It is not investing. It is gambling. So, so we haven't had a lot of choice in New Zealand, right? Everything's steered you towards property. A lot of supply coming on, rental options available, other alternatives, level tax playing field. You can see the writing on the wall. New Zealand's changing, and it will be a lot better for it, because the situation we found ourselves in now is crazy. Yeah. It's crazy.
We're pretty much out of time, but there's something else I'd like to run by you before I let you go, where just to go back to the interest rates thing, because I think it's very interesting that you've brought out this much lower floating rate that is available to, it's available to everyone, right?
It's available to Simplicity members, yeah.
Okay. And it's an interesting move, because I know a lot of people love the Barefoot Investor book series. And same here. I mean, I think he does absolutely brilliant work and has made money a lot more understandable to a lot of people. But there is a bit in it where he talks about put your whole mortgage on floating, because then you can pay it off much faster, which is a great idea in theory, but it also shows that he is an Australian writer writing from an Australian perspective.
Yeah, totally.
Right? And in Australia, that's much cheaper. You can do that. And of course, with floating, you can pay extra on it. You don't get penalized with break fees. Like fixed is it's supposed to be the same amount every time. But their fixed and floating rates are much closer, whereas in New Zealand, our floating rates have traditionally been higher. So what you're doing there is, I think, a really interesting move. Do you think it will be enough to put pressure on the main banks? Do you think there should be pressure on them? Do you think there should be other changes? What's your thought?
Look, I think eventually the reason in Australia that it's the same is that floating and fixed are so close is because the banks don't so dominate the market, in the sense that there's 4 big banks there, but big pension funds, superannuation funds, they can offer cheaper rates, and so they put pressure to lower the floating rate, because it is, and I will use a technical term here, Francis, a technical financial term, it is absolutely insane that the banks are charging 2% more for a floating rate than a fixed rate. Why are they doing it? A 3-word answer: because they can. And they can because they have so much market share. Well, look, I think the government made a really bad decision in allowing Kiwibank to exist in its present form. Kiwibank's a fantastic idea, but it's like a one-arm boxer in a boxing ring with 4 heavyweights. The 4 heavyweight banks get to say, hey, it's a fair fight because we're competing against the state-owned bank. But actually the state-owned bank is undercapitalised, has had to prop up the post office, hasn't been allowed to really set a proper competitive tension. So it's given the Aussie banks the excuse of there being a competitive market, but not the practical reality. Because if Kiwibank didn't exist, then the government could quite rightly regulate rates and be much tougher on the banks. So at the moment, the big 4 Aussie banks are in the perfect operating environment. You could not create a better operating environment anywhere in the world And we know this because they're amongst the most profitable banks in the world, and New Zealand is the most profitable part of those banks. So this is, you talk about dairy milking. The best milking operation going on is the banking industry in New Zealand. They're far more efficient than Fonterra about milking profits out of New Zealand. So Kiwibank has either got to be recapitalised, and ACC and NZ Super have got enough of that now that they should pump a lot of money into it and start boxing with two arms, not just one arm. It's the post office is no longer the huge weight around its neck that it used to be. And you've got some great people in Kiwibank, some great management. They just need the money to do the job. Either that or pack up, go away and regulate the banks in New Zealand. Now, I think we'll go for the former. I think that probably the governments have got a little bit addicted to Kiwibank's dividend as well. They quite like getting this money in every year. But what that is costing New Zealanders is billions and billions of dollars in excess charges, excess mortgages. Now, of course, I would say that, right? But but remember, we're a non-profit, and remember, I'm a gamekeeper turned poacher. I've worked in that world. I know exactly what's going on. And one of the reasons we set up Simplicity was to create competitive tension and try and stop that going on to the extent that it is. So, long answer to your question, Francis, it's going to happen, but it's just going to take time, right? But it will happen. The more members we get, the bigger we get, and there are other people like us out there in the setting competitive tension in the market as well. But mortgage rates should be low, and floating rate. Oh my goodness, it's laughable. And in fact, the banks come back and say, "Oh, not a lot of people want floating rate mortgages." Well, at 4.45%, I wouldn't want either. If you're charging me 2% more for a floating rate mortgage just so I can have the privilege of repaying it when I feel like it, I'm going to charge you 2% more for giving you the choice to repay the money that I've lent you. Come on, it's a joke.
I love that. Well, hey, I will be very interested to see how your forays into housing, the housing market, mortgage market, how they continue going. It's a fascinating area, and I do think you're making waves. So we shall see how that goes. Thank you very much. That's Sam Stubbs from Simplicity. Now, if you have questions,
the ducks say goodbye to.
The ducks say goodbye too. And now, if you have questions about this podcast, anything else to do with money, do get in touch with me. I'm on Facebook, Frances Cook Journalist, Twitter, Frances Cook, Instagram, Frances Cook NZ. Send those questions through. I can't always reply to everyone individually, but I do get as many of them as I can into future podcast episodes. You can also subscribe to Cooking the Books anywhere you find podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Until next time, have a great day.